Welcome back, bug people. Today we're going to be doing another episode of Intro to Insect Taxonomy and Identification. I believe this will be part 20, so we're moving on from the Mantodea, which we talked about last time. If you haven't already, like and subscribe. It does me a favor. It doesn't cost anything, which is really great. So as an overview, what we've talked about, if you'll remember, we talked about the Antenatha, we talked about the primitive insects with no wings, we talked about the Paleoptera, which are the mayflies and the odonates. So these are the insects with wings, but they can't fold them properly behind them. And now we're on to the Neoptera. And these are all of these, the Paleoptera and the Neoptera that we've talked about so far, have been hemimetabolists. So these are insects that don't go through a complete metamorphosis. The immature looks a lot like the adult. They tend to live in the same places and eat the same things. So we talked about the Mantodea last time, after the roaches and the termites. Today we're going to be moving on to two really weird groups that are closely related. Today will specifically be about the Grylloblattodea. And the Grylloblattodea and their cousins, the Mantophasmatodea, are fairly closely related, although otherwise they lead very different lives. And they're the two smallest orders of insects. So the next two videos on this series will be very short, which will be nice. And you can basically learn a ton very quickly because there's not a ton to learn. So with that, we will talk about the Grylloblattidae, which literally means cricket roach, but they are not crickets or roaches. These are sometimes called rock crawlers or ice crawlers or ice bugs, and they tend to be a little strange, not super well understood, and they tend to not have a ton of work done on them. So simplified phylogenetic tree here. It's very, very simple. You have the order Grylloblattodea. There's only one family in the entire order, the Grylloblattids. And if you are in the US, there is only one genus that you need to be concerned about, which is Grylloblatta. There are, I believe, 5 genera worldwide, but in the US, there's only Grylloblatta, and there are 4 specifically named species of Grylloblatta in the US, although there's likely something like 30 or 35 species. From what I could find, the species that have, or the specimens that have been collected, likely represent a large number of unidentified species, all of them within Grylloblatta, or at least it's thought, but no one has taken the time to do a proper workup of describing those species. So for the time being, there's just those 4, and then a bunch of unknowns, kind of like the Pokemon, where you know it's something strange, but you don't have a proper species description and a species name to go along with it. And that's it. So just Grylloblatta or Grylloblattodea, Grylloblattidae, Grylloblatta, if you're in the US, or I believe probably all of North America. So the Grylloblattids, this is what they look like. And you can kind of see where they get their name from. Remember, it's cricket roach. So it's not quite a cricket, it's not quite a roach. It's somewhere in between. Things that you will see about them immediately, they kind of have a roach head, and they have these long filiform antennae. Fairly large eyes. They don't have wings. They are wingless, but they are secondarily wingless. So what that means is that their primitive forms and what they evolved from had wings, and they have since lost those wings. So it is not like the Thysanura or the Archaeonatha and the Zygentoma, which never had wings. They never evolved wings. The Grylloblattids arose from a group which had wings, but they no longer needed them. They also have long cerci on the butt end, similar to their long antennae, and they tend to be very, very thin. And you might be thinking, well, I've seen something like this before. No, you probably haven't, not unless you're a pretty experienced entomologist. So these guys are frequently called ice crawlers. And the reason for that is because they live in extremely cold environments. Usually when we talk about, where they're found, it's on top of mountains in the snow. It's on top of glaciers. It's in snowfields. It's in frozen caves, things like that. They are primarily known from Japan, Siberia, Canada, and the Pacific Northwest of North America, of the United States. So the species like here, the ones that are found in the US, these are primarily found in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, is that ID, I believe, and kind of along the Pacific coast up through the Canadian Pacific coast. They're probably in Alaska. Not that there's been a ton of collecting, I don't think, at least not from what I could find. Um, they're very, very hard to find because you need to be in very rocky, very cold terrain. They and they necessarily need the cold. They will die for anything above 10°C. So they prefer conditions actually very, very close to freezing. So like 1° they prefer, and they can actually survive quite well below freezing, 3 or 4 degrees below zero. So they really do need the cold. As it starts to get warmer, they immediately die. Because they are adapted to the cold, even though they're polycotherms, I think that's the word, and cold-blooded, basically, they require a very long time to complete their life because they're in this cold environment all the time. So it can take them 6 or 7 years to go through one generation. They're extremely slow growing. You can't be super active when it's super cold and you're not warm-blooded. So that's just kind of the conditions they live in. But you might be thinking, but I have seen something that looks like this. If you think you saw something that's like this in your home or your basement or your back garden or whatever, you have likely seen this. This is a Dermaptera. This is an earwig, and they are everywhere. They're fairly closely related to the ice crawlers here. Let me go back. So if you look at this tree, the earwigs are a little farther down. So the Grylloblattids are here, the earwigs are down here. They're still all kind of related, and they kind of have the same body shape, except that they have these pincer-like cerci on the back instead of the thin cerci like the ice crawlers have. And they also have wings. So the Dermaptera still are primarily winged. They haven't become secondarily wingless. And so you may have seen something that looks similar to this. There's a lot of earwigs around in the US. You almost certainly haven't seen this guy. I've never seen one of these alive. But I also don't spend much time on glaciers or mountains. But maybe if you're an experienced entomologist and you've collected one of these or seen them in the wild, leave a comment, tell your story. That would actually be super interesting because there's a few of these very rare orders. I've collected a few of them, but I've never collected any of these. So the Grylloblattids, again, tend to look like this. Or Grylloblatta is the genus that's in the United States. They have a very, very simple body shape, very long, very thin. This is the one that's probably the most common, Grylloblatta campodiiformis. I think, from what I've read, this is probably found in the most states. Although, again, by most states, I mean they've been collected on a couple mountains or in a couple snowfields. It's not like they're everywhere. But that's actually kind of it. Other things that you might, if you're really interested in these, their tarsi are always 5 segmented. Their cerci are considered relatively long compared to like the mantids that we talked about last time. It's 8 segmented. They always have this very, simple body shape. They tend to be omnivorous, but it's because they're primarily detritivores, as far as anyone can tell. Although their life cycle isn't super well documented or anything. They tend to feed on other dead insects if they're around, and then if they're not around, they just feed on rotting vegetation. Some of I believe they're juveniles. They're not nymphs. Would you say nymphs in this? Yeah, they're nymphs. Tend to feed on primarily feed on decaying plants. There's only about 35 species worldwide described, and again, it's primarily in kind of the Arctic, colder regions, so like Siberia and Canada. There are no known species from the Southern Hemisphere, which is kind of interesting. Very, very difficult to collect, but that's it. Now you know about the Grylloblattids. Next time we will talk about their cousin group, the Mantophasmids, which are even kind of weirder. But until then, I'll see you guys later. Thanks.